The heavy oak doors of the frontier church slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. The impact echoed across the snow-covered square, but the townspeople hurrying past kept their heads down. In a brutal winter, survival meant looking away from someone else's doom. Clara Higgins hit the frozen wooden steps hard. She scrambled to break her fall, her bare, trembling hands scraping against the jagged ice. A sharp gasp tore from her throat, cutting through the howling wind. But her first instinct was not to protect her bleeding palms. Instantly, she curled inward, wrapping both arms protectively around her heavily swollen belly. "Stay there and freeze, for all I care," Marcus's voice spat from the top of the steps. Her brother-in-law stood tall, his expensive wool coat securely buttoned against the biting wind. He sneered down at her, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust twisting his features. "My brother was a fool to leave the land to a pathetic, sickly thing like you. The deed belongs to me now. If you show your face at the ranch again, I will have the dogs run you off." He kicked something down the stairs. A small, woven willow basket tumbled over the ice, spilling a few meagre belongings: a wooden hair comb, a ragged wool scarf, and a thick, leather-bound journal. Clara reached out, her fingers stiff and blue from the dropping temperature, desperately pulling the basket back to her chest. She was 22, though the harshness of the frontier and the grief of losing her husband had hollowed her cheeks and painted dark, exhausted circles under her pale blue eyes. Her faded maternity dress, a thin brown wool meant for autumn, offered no resistance to the freezing gale. "Please, Marcus," Clara whispered, her voice cracking, her lips taking on a dangerous bluish tint. "The baby. It's your brother's child. Just let me stay in the barn until the storm passes. Please."
"The barn is for animals that earn their keep," Marcus sneered, turning his back. He glanced at the few townsfolk lingering near the general store. "Anyone who takes her in answers to me," he shouted, ensuring his threat hung heavy in the freezing air. No one moved. The blacksmith suddenly found his boots incredibly interesting. The baker's wife hurried inside and pulled the shutters closed. In this brutal edge of the world, Marcus held the debts of half the town. No one was going to risk their livelihood for a pregnant widow cast out in the snow. Clara squeezed her eyes shut as the church doors locked from the inside. The click of the heavy iron bolt sounded like a death sentence. The wind whipped her blonde hair across her face, stinging her skin like needles. She tried to push herself up, her knees trembling violently against the ice, but her body had nothing left to give. The sheer weight of the child, combined with 2 days of starvation, anchored her to the frozen ground.
Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. She curled tighter around the willow basket, resting her chin against the woven reeds. She wasn't afraid of dying anymore, but the frantic, fluttering kicks against her ribs broke her heart. "I'm sorry," she thought, hot tears instantly freezing on her eyelashes. "I am so sorry, little one." The snow began to fall harder, coating her thin brown dress in a layer of white. The cold was moving past the pain now, settling deep into her bones, bringing a dangerous, heavy drowsiness. Then the wind stopped, or rather, it was blocked. Clara slowly forced her eyes open. A shadow had fallen over her, vast and immovable. She blinked through the frost on her lashes, looking up at a pair of heavy, snow-crusted leather boots. Her gaze travelled up thick wool trousers to a massive canvas coat lined with sheepskin. Elias Thorne stood over her like a mountain of stone. At 45, Elias was a man built by the unforgiving frontier. He possessed a heavy, grounded face, a thick, greying beard, and deep brown eyes that held the quiet intensity of a winter canyon. He was a widowed cattle rancher who lived miles out of town, a man who spoke rarely and tolerated fools even less. He held a glowing storm lantern in one massive, leather-gloved hand. The warm yellow light spilled over Clara's shivering form, illuminating the desperate grip she had on her swollen belly. For a terrifying second, Clara flinched, instinctively bracing for a blow or another cruel command. She shrank back against the frozen steps, her pale blue eyes wide with the ingrained fear of men who use their size to break things. Elias did not speak. He did not ask what she had done, and he did not offer useless pity. He simply set the lantern down on the ice. With slow, deliberate movements, he unbuttoned his heavy, oversized sheepskin coat. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, revealing his thick flannel shirt underneath, indifferent to the biting wind. He knelt. Even on one knee, he was imposing. Clara's breath hitched in panic, but Elias's hands were remarkably slow and steady. He draped the massive, incredibly warm coat over her shaking shoulders, pulling the thick collar up to shield her frozen face. The sudden residual body heat trapped in the wool hit Clara like a physical shock. The scent of pine wood, old leather, and wood smoke enveloped her. At that moment, the church doors rattled and cracked open again. Marcus stepped out, his face flushing red with anger when he saw the rancher. "Thorn!" Marcus barked, his voice laced with nervous bravado. "I told the town to leave her. That is family business. Step away from her." Elias did not even look at him. He reached down, his large, calloused hand picking up the woven willow basket with surprising care. "Did you hear me, Thorn?" Marcus yelled, taking a step down. "She's a thief and a burden. You touch her, and you make an enemy of me." Slowly, Elias stood to his full height. He turned his heavy, blunt face toward Marcus. He didn't rest a hand on the gun at his hip. He didn't need to. The sheer, immovable violence humming beneath Elias's quiet demeanor was enough to make the air feel dangerously thin. "Go back inside, Marcus," Elias said. His voice was a deep, resonating rumble, quiet, but carrying perfectly through the storm. "Before I decide you don't need your teeth to pray." Marcus froze. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Elias's unblinking stare to the massive fists hanging casually at the rancher's sides. Without another word, Marcus backed up, slipping slightly on the ice, and retreated behind the heavy oak doors. Elias turned his attention back to Clara. She was staring at him, her lips parted in disbelief. He reached down, offering a hand roughly the size of a dinner plate. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice softening just to fraction. Clara nodded weakly, though when she gripped his hand, her legs gave out entirely. She would have crashed back onto the ice, but Elias caught her effortlessly. Without asking for permission, he slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, lifting her and the child she carried as easily as if she were made of dry kindling. My basket," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I have it," Elias replied, his chest rumbling against her ear as he carried her toward a heavy wagon waiting in the snow. "You're safe now. Keep the coat tight." As the wagon rolled out of the coward's town and into the teeth of the blizzard, Clara buried her face in the warm sheepskin collar, closing her eyes. She did not know this silent giant, nor did she know the massive stone house waiting at the end of the frozen trail. But for the first time in days, the violent shivering in her chest began to ease. The wagon bucked and groaned against the rising snowdrifts, its heavy wooden wheels fighting for every inch of ground. The storm had fully descended, swallowing the trail and the distant town in a blinding, howling wall of white. Every jolt of the wagon sent a dull ache through Clara's exhausted frame, but she did not complain. She remained curled on the wooden floorboards, completely enveloped in Elias's massive sheepskin coat. The garment was absurdly large on her, the heavy leather swallowing her delicate frame, but it was the only thing keeping the blood moving in her veins. It smelled faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and a deep, masculine earthiness. For a woman who had just been thrown out to die, that scent felt like an anchor, tethering her to the living world. Her hands, still blue and stiff, rested protectively over her swollen belly. She could feel the baby moving again, a slow, rolling press against her ribs, as if the child knew the worst of the cold was retreating. Through the haze of her near-frozen state, the wagon finally slowed. Clara blinked against the harsh wind, her pale blue eyes finding the silhouette of a massive stone structure rising from the valley floor. Unlike the flimsy wooden houses in town, this ranch was built like a fortress. Thick, uneven stones formed the walls, designed to withstand the brutal frontier winters, and warm, golden light spilled from the heavy glass windows, cutting through the blizzard. Elias brought the horses to a halt beneath a wide timber overhang. He did not wait for her to struggle. The snow crunched heavily beneath his boots as he rounded the wagon. Without asking, he reached into the bed, gathering her into his massive arms as easily as he had at the church steps. He carried her and the willow basket against his broad chest, kicking the heavy front door open with the heel of his boot. The moment he carried her across the threshold and kicked the door shut, the deafening roar of the storm was instantly cut off. The silence inside was stunning. It was broken only by the fierce, steady crackle of burning logs. Clara gasped, taking her first full breath of warm air in days. The sharp contrast between the deadly freeze outside and the suffocating warmth of the cabin made her head spin. Elias carried her toward the center of the large room, where a colossal stone hearth dominated the wall. The fire inside was a roaring beast, feeding on thick pine logs. He gently lowered her into a large, deep armchair, positioned perfectly near the hearth. The chair was draped with a thick, soft sheepskin pelt. Clara sank into the chair, her trembling fingers still clutching the willow basket to her chest. She watched with wide, guarded eyes as Elias moved around the room. He was a man of terrifying size and silent efficiency. He took his damp wool hat off, revealing thick, greying hair, and hung it on a wooden peg. He did not hover over her. He did not ask how she felt. He simply went to the cast-iron stove in the corner, shifting a heavy black kettle over the hottest part of the iron surface. Clara flinched instinctively as he picked up a large knife from the table, her breath hitching. But Elias only used it to slice a thick piece of dark bread from a loaf. He set it on a tin plate, carried it to her, and placed it on a small wooden stool beside the armchair. "Eat," he said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble in the quiet house.
Oh,
slowly.
Hello there, little
Clara
one.
stared at the bread. Her stomach cramped violently with hunger, but the lessons of the past months paralyzed her. In her brother-in-law's house, every crumb came with a price, usually a harsh chore or a cruel insult. What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice rasping from the cold. Elias paused, turning back to look at her. The golden firelight caught the deep lines weathered into his face. He saw her shrinking back into his oversized coat, her pale face marked by exhaustion, the torn hem of her muddy dress peeking out from beneath the wool. He saw the violent bruise forming on her wrist from where she had fallen on the ice. "I want you to stop shaking," Elias replied flatly. He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup, dropping a pinch of dried mint into it before walking it over to her. When he handed her the cup, he was careful not to let his rough hands brush her bruised skin. Clara took it, her hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled the steaming water. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. The heat rushed down her throat, settling deep in her chest. A small, ragged sigh escaped her, and she closed her eyes. Elias watched her for a brief second, his gaze dropping to the massive swell of her pregnant belly. Instantly, his jaw tightened. A flash of something raw and deeply painful crossed his steady features. He looked away abruptly, turning his broad back to her as he walked back to the hearth to throw another log onto the fire. Clara opened her eyes, catching the sudden shift in his demeanour. The giant of a man, who had fearlessly stared down her cruel brother-in-law, suddenly looked as though standing near a pregnant woman was burning him alive. He kept his distance, retreating to a wooden chair on the far side of the room, sitting in the shadows where the firelight barely reached. She did not know the ghosts that haunted Elias Thorne's stone sanctuary. She only knew that he had saved her life. Yet he looked at her unborn child as if looking at a tragedy that had already happened. Clara carefully took a small bite of the bread, feeling the baby kick against her ribs. She was safe for the night, surrounded by thick stone walls and a warm fire, but the silence stretching between her and the isolated rancher felt heavy with unspoken sorrow. Outside, the wind screamed against the heavy wooden shutters, a dark reminder that Marcus was still out there, and in the morning, the harsh frontier would demand its due. Morning arrived without the blinding glare of the sun. The blizzard outside had lessened to a steady, heavy snowfall, burying the stone ranch under feet of watch. Inside, the fire had been banked overnight, radiating a deep, persistent heat that kept the frost at bay. Clara woke slowly. For a terrifying second, as she stared at the rough-hewn timber ceiling, panic gripped her chest. But then the smell of pine smoke and the heavy weight of the sheepskin pelt grounded her. She was not on the freezing church steps. She was safe in the stone sanctuary. She sat up in the deep armchair, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. Her pale blue eyes scanned the room. Elias Thorne was nowhere to be seen. The heavy oak front door was securely bolted from the inside, meaning he must have gone out the back through the kitchen to tend to the livestock. Clara pushed the thick sheepskin off her legs. She smoothed down the wrinkled, mud-stained fabric of her thin maternity dress. Her right wrist throbbed, the angry purple bruise from her fall stark against her pale skin. Despite her exhaustion, the ingrained fear of her brother-in-law's house echoed viciously in her mind. You do not eat if you do not work. She refused to be seen as a burden here. She would not give this silent giant a reason to cast her back out into the cold. Bracing her hand against the stone hearth, she forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled under the heavy weight of her belly. She picked up her empty tin cup and the plate from the night before, determined to wash them. She moved slowly across the wooden floorboards toward a wash basin in the corner. As she reached the basin, she paused to catch her breath. Beside it was a narrow set of wooden stairs leading to an open loft. Clara glanced up, intending to see if there was a broom to sweep the hearth. Instead, her gaze locked onto something resting in the shadows near the loft window. It was a wooden crib. Even from the floor below, Clara could see it was not a rough, store-bought piece. It was hand-carved from solid cherry wood, the sides polished smooth, the slats thick and sturdy. Intricate vines and leaves had been painstakingly whittled into the headboard, the work of a man who had poured hours of quiet, patient love into preparing for a child. But there were no blankets inside, no soft toys. It sat in the dim light, immaculate and completely, utterly empty. Clara's breath hitched. Suddenly, Elias's behaviour the night before, the way he had flinched when he looked at her swollen belly, the way he had retreated into the shadows of the room, made a devastating amount of sense.
This massive, unshakable man had built a fortress to protect his family, and somehow the brutal frontier had taken them anyway. To him, she was a walking ghost of his greatest failure. A heavy thud from the back door made her jump. Elias stepped inside, bringing a rush of freezing air with him. His broad shoulders were dusted with fresh snow, and his breath plumed white as he stomped his heavy boots on the mum. He carried an armful of split firewood, moving with that same terrifying, efficient grace. He stopped dead when he saw her standing by the wash basin, clutching the tin cup. His dark, deep-set eyes dropped to her trembling legs, then to the heavy bruise on her wrist. His heavy jaw tightened. He dropped the firewood into the iron bin with a loud clatter that made Clara flinch. "What are you doing?" Elias asked. His voice was not angry, but the sheer, rumbling volume of it filled the quiet room. I was just going to wash these," Clara stammered, taking a step back. Her protective instinct made her curve her shoulders over her belly. "I can clean the ashes. I don't want to be a burden, Mr. Thorne. I earn my keep." Elias stared at her. He saw the genuine terror in her pale eyes, the way she expected a reprimand or a blow for simply existing. Slowly, he reached up and pulled off his leather gloves, tossing them onto the long wooden table. He walked toward her. Clara held her breath, but Elias simply reached out and took the tin cup and plate from her hands. His massive, calloused fingers brushed hers, the contrast between his rough strength and her fragile skin stark. "You are not in Marcus's house," Elias said quietly, his voice losing its harsh edge, dropping to a low, steady rumble. "You do not earn your keep here. You heal." He turned, placing the tinware in the bar. "Sin." Then he walked over to the small wooden table where he had placed her woven willow basket the night before. He carried it over to the armchair and set it gently on the small stool. "Sit down, Clara," he instructed. It was the first time he had used her name. Clara obeyed, her knees giving out as she sank back into the sheepskin pelt. Elias did not retreat to the shadows this time. He stood near the hearth, his large hands resting on his hips as he looked down at the basket. The fall on the ice had knocked the lid loose. Inside, resting beneath her ragged wool scarf, was the thick, leather-bound journal. The cover was weathered and stained. Elias's eyes narrowed. As a man who had spent years surviving the wild, he noticed details others missed. The binding wasn't just old, it was bulging, heavy with extra pages sewn into the spine. A piece of dried sage, tied with a thin strip of rawhide, marked a specific section. It did not look like a simple ledger. "Your brother-in-law called you a thief," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the journal. He did not sound accusing, he sounded analytical. "He called you a burden. Yet he came out into a blizzard to ensure you didn't take that basket."
Thank you.
Clara's hand instinctively darted out, covering the basket. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. The journal had belonged to her late husband, but the newest entries, the maps and the tallies hidden in the back were hers. They were dangerous records of the grain, dried meat and blankets she had secretly smuggled out of Marcus's storehouses last winter. Not for herself, but for the starving Apache families trapped in the northern canyon when the snows had cut them off. It was an act of mercy that the greedy town would view as treason. "It's just my husband's writing," Clara lied, her voice shaking. Elias looked at her hand, covering the leather-bound book like a shield. He saw the fierce, maternal defiance sparking in her tired eyes. She was terrified of him, terrified of the storm, and entirely broken by the town. Yet, she was ready to fight to the death to protect whatever was in that book.
The frail, discarded widow was hiding something massive. Elias slowly looked away, turning his attention to the fire. He picked up an iron poker and shifted the burning pine logs, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. "I don't care what you took from him," Elias said, his broad back to her, his voice offering an unspoken vow. "But if Marcus wants it badly enough to leave a pregnant woman to freeze, you are going to need more than a willow basket to stop the men he sends." By mid-afternoon, the blinding ferocity of the blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a sky the colour of bruised iron. The valley was buried under 3 feet of unbroken wire. Inside the stone house, the silence was heavy, interrupted only by the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the hiss of sap burning in the hearth. Clara sat in the deep armchair, her hands resting protectively over the swell of her belly. The warmth of the fire had finally chased the blue tint from her lips, but the exhaustion in her bones remained. Across the room, Elias sat at the heavy wooden dining table, a scarred piece of oiled leather spread out before him. He was methodically cleaning a Winchester rifle. The metallic snick-clack of the lever action echoed sharply in the quiet room. Elias did not look like a man expecting trouble. He looked like a man who knew trouble was simply a fact of the frontier, as inevitable as the winter freeze. His massive hands moved with practiced, terrifying precision, oiling the steel and checking the chamber. Suddenly, Elias stopped. He didn't jump, and his expression didn't change, but his entire massive frame went completely rigid. He tilted his head slightly toward the thick glass window facing the front trail. Clara felt her pulse spike. "Mr. Thorne?" she whispered. Elias stood up slowly, the rifle held casually in his right hand. "Stay in the chair, Clara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument. "Move back into the shadows. Do not stand in front of the glass." He walked to the window, using the barrel of the rifle to push aside the heavy canvas curtain just an inch. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the willow basket against her chest, her knuckles turning white. Through the thick frost on the pane, 3 dark shapes emerged from the tree line, fighting their way up the snow-choked trail. They were men on horseback, their mounts breathing heavy plumes of white steam into the freezing air. Marcus had not come himself. He was far too much of a coward to face the cold or Elias Thorne directly. Instead, he had sent his hired muscle, men who collected debts with brass knuckles and intimidation. Elias dropped the curtain. He reached for his heavy sheepskin coat, slipping it on over his broad shoulders, and then picked up his wide-brimmed hat. "They've come for me," Clara said, her voice shaking violently. The terror of the church steps rushed back, threatening to suffocate her. "Marcus knows I have his brother's journal. He knows I know the land deed was altered. He will take the baby." "Clara." Elias's voice cut through her panic. It wasn't loud, but it possessed an immovable, anchoring weight. He looked at her, his deep brown eyes entirely calm. "I built these walls thick," he said slowly, stepping toward the heavy oak door. "And I don't let trash over my threshold. Keep by the fire." Elias threw the heavy iron bolt and opened the door, stepping out onto the covered porch. The brutal cold hit him instantly, but he did not flinch. He pulled the door shut behind him with a solid thud, leaving Clara inside, though she immediately slid out of the chair and crept toward the window, peering through the small gap in the curtain. Outside, the 3 riders pulled their exhausted horses to a halt at the edge of the porch steps. The leader, a scarred, mean-looking man named Vance, rested his hand near the holster at his hip. "Thorne!" Vance called out, his breath pluming in the icy air. "Hell of a day to be standing on the porch." Elias stood at the top of the steps, his feet planted wide, his massive frame blocking the door. He held the Winchester casually across his chest, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. He did not say a word. He simply stared down at the three men with a look of absolute, terrifying stillness. Vance shifted uncomfortably under the rancher's gaze.
"Marcus sent us," he continued, trying to sound authoritative. "Says you took something that belongs to him off the church steps yesterday. A widow and a basket. We're here to collect." "She's a woman," Elias rumbled, his voice carrying like thunder over the snowy yard. "Not a stray dog.
"And she isn't going anywhere with you."
"Now listen here, Thorn," one of the other men spat, urging his horse a step closer. "Marcus holds the paper on her husband's land. He holds the paper on her. She's his property until her debts are paid. You hand her over, or this gets ugly."
"Property," Elias repeated softly. The words seemed to leave a foul taste in his mouth. Behind the glass, Clara held her breath, tears stinging her eyes. She had been treated like a burden, a ledger entry, and a piece of property for so long that hearing it spoken aloud felt like a physical blow. "I won't ask twice," Vance warned, his fingers twitching toward his revolver. "Bring the pregnant bitch out here, or we go in and get her." The moment the insult left Vance's mouth, the stillness broke. Elias didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. In a blur of motion that defied his massive size, the Winchester came up to his shoulder. His thumb pulled back the hammer with a sharp, lethal click. Bang! The gunshot shattered the frozen silence of the valley. Clara jumped, clamping a hand over her mouth. Elias hadn't aimed for the men. He had fired a single round directly into the thick ice on the top step, less than 2 feet from Vance's horse. The sharp crack of the rifle and the exploding shards of ice sent the animal into a panic, rearing up and nearly throwing Vance into the snow. Elias worked the lever action effortlessly, chambering another round before the echo of the first shot had even faded. He leveled the smoking barrel directly at Vance's chest. "The next one," Elias said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet rasp, "goes through your ribs. Get off my land."
Quiet.
The three men struggled to control their panicked horses.
Still.
The false bravado was entirely gone from Vance's face, replaced by genuine, wide-eyed fear. He looked at the smoking barrel of the Winchester,
Quiet.
then at the unblinking, murderous calm in Elias's
Stay
eyes.
still.
"Marcus ain't gonna let this go, Thorn," Vance yelled as he spurred his horse around.
"He'll come back with 12 men!"
"Tell him to bring boxes," Elias replied coldly. "You'll need them." He stood on the porch like a statue, the rifle steady, watching as the three men spurred their horses back down the snow-choked trail, retreating into the tree line. Only when they were completely out of sight did Elias lower the weapon. Inside, Clara was trembling so hard her knees gave out. She sank to the floor beneath the window, hugging her swollen belly, tears spilling down her cheeks. But they were not tears of fear. The heavy oak door opened, and Elias stepped back inside, bringing a swirl of snowflakes with him. He bolted the door and leaned the rifle against the stone wall. He looked down and saw Clara sitting on the floor, weeping silently. He frowned, taking a slow step toward her. "Did they frighten you?" he asked, his voice returning to that low, careful rum. Clara looked up at him through her tears. She looked at this massive, scarred man who had just risked a blood feud with the most powerful man in town to protect a woman he barely knew. She shook her head, a watery, desperate smile breaking across her exhausted face.
Open the doors!
"No," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No, Mr. Thorne. For the first time in my life, I am not afraid at all. Fear is a fire that burns through a body's reserves, And for the last 2 days, Clara had been burning too hot for too long. The adrenaline of the confrontation on the porch finally evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow exhaustion. As Elias reached down to help her up from the floor, Clara swayed. The stone walls of the cabin seemed to tilt violently. A sudden, bone-deep chill racked her frame, followed immediately by a wave of suffocating heat. Her knees buckled. Elias caught her before she hit the floorboards. Even through the thick wool of her dress and the sheepskin coat, he could feel the unnatural, radiating heat of her skin. The flush of severe fever was creeping up her pale neck, a delayed, vicious reaction to the hours she had spent freezing on the church steps. "Clara," Elias said, his voice sharp with sudden urgency. She couldn't answer. Her head rolled against his broad chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. Elias's heart hammered against his wrists. He looked down at her flushed face, and for a split second, the cabin vanished. He was a younger man again, listening to the howling wind of a winter storm a decade past, watching helplessly as a fever took the only 2 things he had ever loved. He looked up toward the loft, where the shadow of the empty, hand-carved cherry-wood crib sat in the darkness. The old, familiar ghost of his failure wrapped a cold hand around his throat. Not again, Elias thought, his heavy jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. Not under my roof. Never again. He shoved the memories down, replacing the paralyzing grief with absolute, rigid focus. He carried Clara to the heavy timber bed, situated in the warmest corner of the room, laying her down gently. He pulled off her damp boots and layered 2 thick wool blankets over her shivering form, making sure the heavy sheepskin coat remained tucked around her shoulders. Then he went to work. He dragged a stool beside the bed, bringing a basin of cold water and a clean linen cloth. For the next several hours, the frontier rancher did not leave her side. He wrung out the cloth, his massive, calloused hands moving with startling gentleness as he pressed the cool linen to her burning forehead and flushed cheeks. Every time she whimpered or thrashed against the heat, he was there, a quiet, immovable anchor in the storm of her fever. Sometime past midnight, the situation elated. Clara suddenly cried out, her back arching off the mattress. Her eyes snapped open, wide and glazed with fever. She kicked the blankets away, her bruised hands clamping desperately over her swollen belly. "No," she gasped, her voice raw with terror. "No, it hurts. It's too early. The baby. Please, it's too early." The stress and the extreme temperature shifts were triggering premature contractions. Elias froze. The absolute worst fear a man could harbour in the isolated frontier was a complicated birth without a doctor. But as Clara sobbed, curling into a tight, agonizing ball, Elias knew that if he panicked, she would break. He set the wet cloth down. He reached out and caught her flailing, bruised wrist, holding it firmly but gently in his massive grip. "Clara, look at me." His voice was a deep, resonating rumble, carrying the weight of a stone mountain. It was so steady, so devoid of fear, that it cut straight through the fog of her panic. Clara blinked, her tear-filled eyes locking onto his weathered face in the dim firelight. "I cannot lose this baby," she sobbed, her fingers digging into his rough palm. "Marcus, he took everything else. This is all I have. Please." "You are not losing anything tonight," Elias vowed, his voice absolute. "Breathe. Listen to the clock. Listen to the fire." He did something he had not done in 10 years. He reached out with his free hand and placed it gently, firmly, directly over the massive swell of her belly. Clara gasped at the contact, but the sheer, grounding warmth of his large hand seemed to absorb the frantic tension in her muscles.
Thank you.
Elias looked down at her belly, his dark eyes fierce and uncompromising.
You'll be safe here.
He spoke not just to
Try and
Clara,
rest.
but to the unborn child fighting against the stress of the harsh world.
Thank you.
It is freezing out there, little one, Elias rumbled, his voice softening into a deep, protective cadence.
The wind is howling and the trail is blocked. This is no night to travel. You have a warm place waiting, but you stay put. You hear me? You stay put until the storm passes. Your mother is tired, and she needs to rest. I am keeping watch. Nothing is coming through that door. Clara stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. The man who had been terrified to even look at her pregnancy earlier was now holding her together with the sheer force of his will. The vibration of his deep voice against her side, the heavy, secure weight of his hand. It was a promise made in the wilderness, a vow that he would stand between her and death itself. Slowly, incredibly, the violent cramping began to ease. Clara let out a long, shaky breath, her head sinking back into the feather pillow. The child, as if listening to the quiet giant's command, settled into a slow, rolling movement rather than frantic kicks. Elias did not pull his hand away immediately. He waited until the tension fully left her body, until her breathing slowed to a steady, exhausted rhythm.
Together.
He dipped the cloth in the cool water one last
Just a
time,
little
pressing it to her
longer.
forehead. Elias, Clara
You are
whispered,
with me.
her eyes fluttering shut. It was the first time she had used his
Together.
given name. I'm here,
Just a little
he answered quietly.
longer.
The journal, she mumbled, the fever pulling her back into sleep. In the basket. I didn't steal.
Don't try to
I
fight
fed
it.
them.
Just
The women in the
rest
canyon.
now.
I had to feed them.
Keep
Elias
breathing,
frowned,
just
glancing
like
over at the
that.
willow basket resting on the table. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but
Don't
it didn't
try to
matter.
fight it.
He pulled the blankets
Just
back up to her
rest
chin.
now.
By dawn, the fever broke. A
Welcome,
cool,
little
natural
one.
sweat replaced the burning heat, and Clara fell into a deep,
It's time
healing
to
sleep.
rest now.
Elias remained in the wooden chair beside the bed. His Winchester rifle rested across his knees, his eyes
Welcome,
fixed on the
little
heavy
one.
oak door. The storm outside was gathering strength
It's time
again,
to
and he
rest
knew
now.
Marcus would not take the humiliation on the porch lightly. But as Elias listened to the soft, even breathing of the woman and child in his bed, the ghosts in the stone house finally went quiet. He had a family to protect, and God help any man who tried to take them away. The grandfather clock chimed 5 times. Evening had brought a darkness so thick it felt like ink spilling against the frosted windows. The wind howled with renewed fury, battering the stone walls of the sanctuary.
Here she
But inside,
is,
the temperature remained steadily warm.
safe and sound.
Clara sat on the edge of the heavy timber bed, her pale hands resting on the sheepskin coat draped across her lap.
Always.
The fever had completely broken,
Here she is,
leaving her physically drained, but mentally
safe
sharp.
and sound.
Her pale blue eyes followed Elias Thorne as he moved around the dim cabin. He had pulled a heavy wooden crate from beneath the floorboards.
You are so
On the long dining table lay his Winchester rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, and 2 heavy Colt revolvers. He was methodically counting brass cartridges, his massive hands moving with a grim, practiced efficiency.
beautiful.
The metallic clicks of the ammunition being loaded sounded abnormally loud in the quiet house.
My sweet baby.
He is coming back,
Finally
isn't he?
safe.
Clara asked, her voice quiet but steady. Elias didn't look up from the shotgun. Vance is a coward, but Marcus is greedy. Greed makes men bold when they think they have the numbers. Clara looked at the woven willow basket resting on the stool near the hearth. It's the journal, she said softly, the truth finally breaking through her fear. He knows I kept a record of the grain and the winter blankets. He starved the town, Elias. He hoarded the supplies and sold the excess to the mining camps across the ridge at 5 times the price. Elias paused, slipping a brass shell into the shotgun's chamber. He looked at her.
Waiting. But I took a portion of it, Clara confessed, her voice trembling slightly, though she kept her chin raised with fierce dignity. Before the worst of the snows hit, I smuggled it out. I gave it to the Apache families trapped in the northern canyon. Their women and children were starving because Marcus blocked the river crossing. If the town finds out I gave away their winter stores to natives, they will hang me. If Marcus gets the journal, he can destroy the evidence, silence me, and claim my husband's land entirely. She looked at Elias, her eyes brimming with tears. I brought death to your door, Elias. Let me leave. If I walk out there and give him the book...
You take one step toward that door, and I will tie you to that chair, Elias interrupted. He snapped the shotgun barrel shut with a sharp, heavy clack. He turned to her, his deep brown eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising light. You fed starving women and children, Clara. That is not a crime in this house. And as for my door, it is thick enough. Just then, a faint, unnatural glow flickered through the cracks in the heavy wooden shutters. It was not moonlight. It was fire. Elias immediately blew out the oil lanterns in the cabin, plunging the room into darkness, lit only by the dying orange embers of the hearth. Stay down, he commanded, his voice a low rumble. Do not move from that bed. Outside, underneath the screaming wind, came the heavy, crunching thud of multiple horses and the angry shouts of men. Marcus had not brought 3 men this time. He had brought a dozen. Torches hissed and sputtered in the falling snow, casting long demonic shadows across the white yard. Thorn! Marcus's voice echoed, amplified by the natural bowl of the valley. I know you're in there. I brought half the town with me. You're harboring a thief. Clara huddled against the pillows, her arms wrapped tightly around her belly, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Elias picked up the shotgun and walked to the door. He didn't bother looking through the window. He threw the heavy iron bolt and stepped out onto the covered porch, leaving Clara in the protective gloom of the cabin. The freezing wind whipped at Elias's flannel shirt, but he stood like a granite statue. Below him, 12 men on horseback fanned out across the yard. Marcus sat safely in the middle, a thick scarf wrapped around his face, pointing a gloved finger at the rancher. I gave you a warning, Thorn, Marcus yelled over the storm. Hand over the widow and her basket. You do that, and we ride away. Elias rested the shotgun casually over his forearm, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. And if I don't? Marcus sneered, gesturing to the men holding torches. Your house is stone, but your barn is wood. You've got 50 head of cattle in there, and enough winter feed to last till spring. You want to die for a pregnant stray? Fine. We'll burn your livelihood to the ground and smoke you out. The threat was a frontier death sentence. Without the barn and the feed, Elias would lose everything he had spent 10 years building. He would freeze and starve just as surely as if they shot him. Inside, Clara let out a stifled sob. She scrambled toward the door, intending to surrender herself to save the man who had saved her. But before she could reach the handle, Elias's voice boomed across the yard, carrying a terrifying, unyielding authority. You step within 20